Hi, my name is John. I'm going to be your occupational therapist today. I'm going to perform a couple goniometric measurements of your shoulder, elbow, wrist, forearm.
Hi, John. Let's get started.
All right, sounds good. So first up is shoulder flexion. You will put the axe on the humeral head, which is 1.5 inches below the acromion process, which is right here. I'm going to need you to abduct to flex your forearm. The stationary arm is going to be parallel with the trunk, while the movable arm is lateral on the lateral epicondyle. And right here, we are looking at approximately 141 degrees. Next up, we have horizontal adduction. The pivot is going to be at the glenohumeral head, which is at the acromion process. Perform the movement for me. Distal arm, okay, lined up with the lateral epicondyle, parallel with the trunk, looking at about 110 degrees. For internal rotation, the axis goes on the olecranon process of the elbow, the movable arm on parallel to the ulna, and the stationary arm is going to be parallel with the trunk. Go ahead and perform the motion for me. Okay, looking at right around 72 degrees. So for elbow flexion, we're going to line up with the lateral epicondyle for the axis, the center of the humerus for the stationary arm, and the radius for the movable arm. He is fully extended, looking at about 4 degrees currently. Go ahead and perform flexion. Looking at roughly 144 degrees of elbow flexion, so 4 through 144. The axis proximal to the ulnar styloid process. Go ahead and perform supination. Looking at approximately 95 degrees. For wrist flexion, we have the axis on the pisiform, stationary bar on the ulna, and movable arm on the 5th metacarpal. Go ahead and perform flexion. Looking right at 79 degrees of wrist flexion.
This is wrist extension. We have the axis on the pisiform and the movable bar, perform extension on the 5th metacarpal, the stationary bar, and the ulnar process. And right now we have 45 degrees. This is forearm pronation. The axis is on the proximal side of the xyloid process of the ulna. Perform pronation for me. You have to follow along. The axis moves a little bit. The stationary bar perpendicular to the floor, and the 75 degrees was our angle. This is elbow extension. We find the lateral epicondyle as the axis point, and then we line up with the trunk of the body, or the humerus, yeah. And then the moving arm goes with the forearm. We start at 135 degrees, extend for me, and we get to 20 degrees. External rotation, we're going to go to the olecranon process. We're going to keep both arms parallel to the forearm, and then go ahead and move. Alright, we got 90 degrees. This is horizontal shoulder abduction. We're going to have the stationary arm towards the neck, the acromion process as the axis. Go ahead and perform for me. And then you move this along the arm, and he has 20 degrees. We're doing shoulder abduction. You find the acromion process on the posterior aspect of the shoulder, and then both arms are perpendicular to the ground, or parallel to the trunk. Alright, go ahead for me. This is going to move just a little bit. And then we got 167 at 5. This is shoulder extension. You find the humeral head, which is going to be 1 inch below the acromion process. And then both arms down like this. So go ahead and perform. Looks like we got 37 degrees. Performing shoulder external rotation, you're going to palpate the teres minor or the supra-infraspinatus. You're going to support under the distal end of the humerus, and then perform the action. Resist. He's a 5.
So for internal rotation, we will stabilize the distal end of the humerus, palpate the teres major and lat along the axillary border, have the client perform the motion, and provide resistance at the distal end of the forearm, and he is a 5. For shoulder flexion, we will stabilize the shoulder, palpate the anterior deltoid, and have the client perform shoulder flexion. We will then provide resistance on the distal aspect of the humerus, and he is a 5.
Extension, you stabilize the scapula, palpate the teres major and the latissimus dorsi, have the patient client perform, and put resistance on the distal end of the humerus. He's a 5. This is shoulder abduction. You stabilize the scapula and palpate the middle deltoid. You're going to have your client perform shoulder abduction to 90 degrees and perform resistance on the distal end of the humerus. He's a 5.
So for horizontal adduction, we will stabilize the anterior shoulder, palpate the insertion of the pectoralis major on the axilla, and observe the client internally or adduct the shoulder while providing resistance on the distal end of the humerus, and he is a 5.
This is the horizontal abduction, and you stabilize the scapula and palpate the posterior deltoid. You have the client perpendicular to the floor, and you have them provide the movement, and then distal humerus is where you provide resistance. He's a 5.
Elbow flexion, we will provide stabilization at the distal end of the humerus, palpate the biceps brachii muscle, observe the client perform flexion, and provide resistance at the distal end of the forearm, and the client is a 5.
This is elbow extension. You have the client prone and seated with 90-degree angle towards the floor. You provide support at the distal end of the humerus. You have him You palpate the tricep. You have him perform, and you provide resistance at the distal end of the forearm. He's a 5. This is forearm pronation. I'm going to palpate the pronator teres. I'm going to support the humerus, and I'm going to have him pronate. At that point, I will provide resistance the other direction. That makes him a 5.
So for forearm supination, we are going to provide support to the distal end of the humerus, palpate the supinator muscle, which is right there, observe the client supinate, and try to pull him back by providing resistance to the distal end of the forearm. And I can't do it. He is a 5.